The wire clicked live at 6:47 in the evening, and Frank Delaney held his breath in the surveillance van, parked 3 blocks south on 2nd Avenue. Through the static hiss came the scrape of chair legs on marble, the muted clink of silverware against porcelain, and then voices. Low voices. Careful voices. The kind that understood walls had ears, but believed money could silence them. Outside the van, Manhattan moved in its October rhythm, oblivious to what was being recorded, inside a private dining room at Rossini's, a restaurant that catered to men who preferred their business conducted over veal piccata and Barolo. Delaney pressed the headphones tighter against his skull, watching the reel-to-reel spools turn in the dim amber light. Beside him, Technical Agent Morris adjusted the gain without a word. They had been waiting for this dinner for 11 months. The operation had begun not with a tip but with a pattern. Carla Ruiz, an analyst with the FBI Organized Crime Division, had spent the better part of a year cross-referencing credit card receipts, telephone tolls, and known associate movements across 5 boroughs. What emerged was a rhythm. Every 3rd Thursday, a reservation appeared under the name Castellano at Rossini's on East 46th Street. The reservation was always for 6. The guests were never photographed entering together, but the vehicles parked within a 2-block radius told a different story. Town cars registered to shell companies in Delaware, drivers with prior arrests for racketeering, and on one occasion, a limousine owned by a waste management firm under active investigation for bid rigging and labor intimidation. Ruiz had brought the pattern to her supervisor, who brought it to Delaney, and Delaney brought it to a judge who signed the warrant 3 weeks later. The installation had been delicate. Rossini's was not mob-owned, but its owner, Anthony Rossini, understood the value of discretion. He also understood the cost of refusing cooperation when FBI agents appeared with a court order and photographs of his late-night deliveries from a distributor flagged for tax evasion. The compromise was surgical. No visible agents, no disruption to business. Just a microphone the size of a dime embedded in the wainscoting of the private dining room, wired through the walls to a junction box in the basement, and from there to a dedicated line that fed directly into the van Delaney now occupied. Rossini would not be called to testify. His name would not appear in any filing. In exchange, the FBI would own every word spoken in that room, for as long as the warrant remained active. Tonight was the 4th dinner they had recorded, and it was different. The guests had arrived within 10 minutes of each other, which was unusual. Dominic Farina, a capo in the Lucci's family, known for his control over the garment district. Vincent D'Amico, whose waste-hauling empire stretched from Staten Island to North Jersey. Michael Torello, a union delegate with ties to the Gambino administration. Paul Giordano, a defense attorney who represented more made men than any lawyer south of the Bronx. And finally, Leo Marconi, whose legitimate holdings in real estate masked a money laundering apparatus that the FBI had been circling for over a decade. The 6th seat remained empty, as it always did. No one knew who it was reserved for, and no one at the table ever acknowledged the absence. The conversation began with small talk, as it always did. Farina complained about the zoning commission. D'Amico mentioned his daughter's wedding. Torello talked about the Yankees. But 20 minutes in, after the wine had been poured, and the doors to the private room closed by a waiter who knew not to return unless summoned, the tone shifted. Giordano's voice dropped half an octave, and he said something that made Delaney sit forward in the van. He said the name of a federal prosecutor. Then he said the name of a grand jury witness. Then he said the word problem, and the table went quiet for 3 seconds. that felt like 30. What followed was 42 minutes of the most incriminating dialogue Delaney had ever heard on a wire. They spoke in coded language, but the code was thin. They discussed shipments that were clearly not legitimate freight. They referenced payments to union officials by name and amount. Marconi outlined a laundering structure involving offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and shell corporations in Panama that existed solely to repatriate cash from illegal gambling operations in Atlantic City. Farina mentioned a contractor who had refused to pay protection and was now facing labor strikes organized by men Torello could call off with a single phone call. D'Amico talked about a state inspector who had been asking questions about waste disposal sites and how those questions had stopped after a visit from someone described only as our friend in Trenton. And Giordano, with the calm precision of a man who had never been indicted despite 30 years of proximity to organized crime, explained how a pending RICO case could be derailed if a particular witness developed concerns about his safety and refused to testify. Morris was writing everything down in shorthand, his pen moving fast across the legal pad. Delaney did not move. He understood what they were hearing. This was not just evidence of criminal conspiracy. This was a roadmap. A dozen prosecutions could spring from this single recording. Asset seizures, indictments, testimony that could flip lower-level associates and climb the ladder toward men whose names appeared on hospital wings and charitable foundations. The Bureau had been chasing the Luccis and Gambino families for decades with limited success, hemmed in by Omert and expensive legal defense teams that exploited every procedural ambiguity. But this tape, if authenticated and introduced under the federal wiretap statute, could fracture that wall. The dinner ended at 9:38. The men stood, exchanged brief words that were inaudible over for the scrape of chairs, and left through separate exits as they always did. Delaney removed his headphones and looked at Morris, who looked back with an expression that mirrored his own. They did not speak. There was nothing to say that was not already understood. Morris labeled the tape, logging the date, time, location, and case number in block letters. Delaney radioed the outer surveillance units to confirm the subjects had dispersed without incident. Then he secured the reel in a tamper-evident bag, signed the chain of custody form, and locked it in the steel case bolted to the floor of the van. By 11:15, Delaney was back at Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan, delivering the tape to the evidence control unit on the 5th floor. The technician on duty, a man named Pollard, signed for it and placed it in a climate-controlled locker with restricted access. Standard procedure. The tape would be duplicated the following morning, with copies sent to the prosecuting attorney, the case supervisor, and the audio analysis lab for voice identification and transcript preparation. Delaney filed his report, noting the significance of the recording and recommending an expedited review by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. He left the building at midnight, walking south through streets slicked with rain, feeling the weight of 11 months lift off his shoulders. 3 days later, the tape was gone. Not missing, not misplaced. Gone. Delaney learned about it in a meeting he had not been told to attend. He arrived at the office that Friday morning to find Assistant Director Harlan Voss waiting at his desk with an expression that communicated nothing and everything. Voss was a 26-year veteran of the Bureau, a man whose career had been built on precision and an almost pathological adherence to procedure. He was not someone who appeared at your desk unless something had gone profoundly wrong. He asked Delaney to follow him, and Delaney did. Down 2 flights of stairs to a conference room where Carla Ruiz, Morris, and 3 agents from Internal Affairs were already seated. Voss did not waste time. The tape from October 16th, the Rossini's recording, had been logged into evidence control at 23:17 hours. It had been checked out the following morning at 08:45 by senior audio technician Raymond Kemp for duplication. Kemp had signed the log, transported the tape to the audio lab on the 8th floor, and begun the transfer process. At 10:30, Kemp left the lab to attend a scheduled meeting with the technical services supervisor. When he returned at 11:15, the tape was no longer on the duplicator. The door to the lab had been closed, but not locked. Security footage from the hallway showed no one entering or exiting during the 45-minute window. The tape had simply ceased to exist. Delaney felt something cold settle in his chest. He asked the obvious question. Were there backups? Voss said there were not. The duplicates had not yet been made. The original was the only copy. He asked about the logs. Voss said the logs showed no additional access. He asked about Kemp. Voss said Kemp had been with the Bureau for 14 years and had a spotless record, but he was being questioned. He asked if anyone outside the immediate case team knew about the recording. Voss paused before answering, and in that pause, Delaney understood the shape of what was happening. Voss said the recording had been mentioned in a briefing memo that had been circulated to division heads and the U.S. Attorney's Office. 18 people had known about the tape's existence and potential evidentiary value before it disappeared. The investigation that followed was meticulous and went nowhere. Internal Affairs interviewed everyone with access to the 5th and 8th floors. They reviewed entry logs, security footage, phone records, and email correspondence. They searched for financial irregularities, sudden changes in behavior, any indication that someone inside the Bureau had been compromised. They found nothing. Kemp passed a polygraph. So did Pollard. The agents who had been briefed on the case submitted to questioning without hesitation and provided alibis for the relevant time frame. The U.S. Attorney's Office cooperated fully, turning over internal memos and staff schedules, and still the tape remained gone, as though it had never existed at all. But Delaney knew it had existed. He had heard it. Morris had transcribed parts of it. Ruiz had read the preliminary report. The problem was that memory and second-hand notes were not evidence. The federal rules of criminal procedure were unambiguous about the admissibility of recordings made under Wiretap authority. The original tape, or a certified duplicate created under chain of custody protocols, was required. Anything else was hearsay. Without the tape, the prosecution had nothing. The subjects who had dined at Rossini's that night could not be indicted based on an FBI agent's recollection of a conversation, no matter how detailed. The case stalled. Weeks became months. The warrant expired. Rossini's continued serving its clientele without interruption. Farina, D'Amico, Torello, Giordano, and Marconi went about their lives, untouched and unindicted. The investigation into the tape's disappearance eventually closed without resolution, filed away in a drawer of unresolved internal matters that no one wanted to examine too closely. Officially, it was classified as a catastrophic evidence handling failure. Unofficially, it was understood as something else. Something that no one wanted to name, because naming it meant admitting that the institution they served was not immune to the same corruptions it fought. Delaney did not let it go. He could not. He spent hours reviewing the case file, looking for angles that had been missed. He re-interviewed informants, hoping one of them might offer a detail that could corroborate the contents of the recording. He requested financial records for everyone who had been in the loop, pushing until Voss told him directly to stop. The tape was gone. The case was dead. Pursuing it further would only damage his career and the Bureau's reputation. Delaney heard the warning for what it was and complied, at least outwardly. But at night, alone in his apartment in Brooklyn, he replayed the recording in his mind, trying to hold on to the exact words, the exact inflections, as though memory alone could preserve what had been taken. Carla Ruiz left the Bureau 6 months later. She did not cite the missing tape as her reason, but Delaney knew it was part of the calculus. She had spent a year building the case, and it had dissolved in 45 minutes of unexplained absence. She took a position with a private intelligence firm in Washington, and Delaney did not blame her. Morris requested a transfer to the white-collar division and got it. The team that had worked the Rossini surveillance scattered, reassigned to other cases, other cities, other battles against an underworld that never seemed to shrink no matter how many arrests were made. 14 months after the tape disappeared, on a Tuesday morning in December, Delaney received a package at his office. It was a standard manila envelope, addressed to him by name, with no return address. The postmark was Manhattan, but the sorting code was smudged and unreadable. Inside was a cassette tape unlabeled, wrapped in plain paper. No note. No explanation. Just the tape. Delaney stared at it for a long time before he moved. Then he walked down to the audio lab, the same lab where the original had vanished, and asked a technician he trusted to play it. The voice that came through the speakers was Dominic Farina's, then Vincent D'Amico's, then Michael Torello's. It was the dinner. Every word, every pause, every incriminating exchange that Delaney had listened to in the surveillance van on East 46th Street. The recording was clear, unedited, and undeniably authentic. Someone had made a copy. Someone had kept it hidden for over a year. And now, someone had decided Delaney should have it. He did not know who. He did not know why. But as he stood in the audio lab, listening to the ghosts of that October evening speak again, he understood that the truth was more complicated than he had imagined. The tape had not been destroyed. It had been protected, and whoever had protected it had just handed him a weapon that could still be used. He never found out who sent it. He tried. He traced the postmark, analyzed the envelope, searched for any detail that might lead him to the source. But the sender had been careful, and the trail ended in a dead letter drop in Midtown that yielded nothing. The tape itself was eventually authenticated and submitted as evidence in a revived investigation that led to 14 indictments, including 3 of the men who had dined at Rossini's that night. The prosecutions took years. Some ended in convictions, others in plea deals. Giordano was never charged. Marconi died of a heart attack before the trial concluded. But the cases moved forward, built on the foundation of a recording that had been lost and then, inexplicably, found. Delaney thought about the missing months often. He thought about the 18 people who had known about the tape. He thought about the locked doors and the security footage that showed nothing. He thought about the possibility that someone inside the Bureau had taken the tape to protect the men on it, and then reconsidered when the cost of that protection became clear. Or perhaps someone had taken it to protect the Bureau itself, to bury evidence of a compromise too damaging to acknowledge, and then changed their mind when silence became more dangerous than exposure. He would never know. The investigation into the disappearance remained closed, its conclusions redacted in reports that few people ever read. What Delaney did know was that the tape had been kept safe by someone who understood its value and its danger, someone who had access and motive, and the discipline to wait until the right moment, someone who believed, despite everything, that the truth mattered more than loyalty to an institution or fear of consequence. That person had never identified themselves, had never asked for recognition or protection, had simply returned what had been taken and disappeared back into the machinery of a system too large and too complex for any one person to fully understand. Years later, after Delaney had retired and the Rossini case had faded into the archives, he still kept the envelope. It sat in a drawer in his home office, empty now, but preserved as a reminder that the fight against organized crime was not just fought in the streets and courtrooms, but in the quiet places where choices were made about what to protect and what to expose. A reminder that betrayal came from all sides, and sometimes so did redemption. And in the end, the tape kept playing long after the voices were gone.